Israel and the United Arab Emirates agreed last Thursday to establish full diplomatic ties in a breakthrough deal brokered by the United States. It's only the third peace deal that Israel has reached with an Arab country since becoming an independent state in 1948. Not only are there expectations for greater trade and diplomatic ties between the two sides, but also hope for wider regional peace and stability. But the Trump administration brokered deal also comes at a time when China's influence is expanding in the region, causing many to wonder if the deal was largely designed to offset Beijing's growing regional clout and its closer ties with Iran. We discussed this today with James M. Dorsey, Senior Fellow at Singapore's Nanyang Technological University. Hello there.
Good morning.
Thank you for being on the show. We also have Samuel Ramani, a doctoral candidate in politics and international relations at the University of Oxford. He's joining us from Toronto, Canada today. It's lovely to see you.
Thank you very much. It's great to be on the show.
Well, why don't we start with you, James? My first question to you, which is, so the Israel and UAE deal seeing it as a breakthrough, really. What's in it for both countries to actually sign on the dotted line? Do you think they're trying to counter Iran's influence?
Well, Iran is certainly a major factor in this, but it's certainly not the only factor. There are multiple other ones. For the Israelis, this is in a sense a godsend for Benjamin Netanyahu. It does two things for him. It takes him off the hook in terms of his pledge to annex part of the West Bank by last July. And it is proof of concept in the sense that he has long argued that relations with the Arab world are not dependent on a solution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. What it does for the UAE is multifold. It positions the UAE, particularly in Washington, at a time of uncertainty, both in terms of the current administration as well as in terms of whatever may be the future administration following the November presidential elections. It also gives a more open, more formalized access by the UAE to Israeli technology, which is very important to the Emiratis. And it opens the prospect of being able to acquire certain U.S. weapon systems, like, for example, the F-35 fighter jet, without the Israelis objecting to that.
So really it comes at a very opportune time. Well, Samuel, how do you see this? What do you think are the biggest benefits to this deal? And do you think it will lead to greater stability in the region?
And that's a great question. I think that the benefits are largely what James said, but I would also like to note the fact that this is not just a deal that's being made against Iran. It's also a deal that's being made against Turkey as well, because the UAE and Turkey's relationship has greatly deteriorated over the past several months over the intervention in Libya, which has led to a Turkish military success. Turkey's maritime security agreement with the GNA and drilling for offshore oil in the Eastern Mediterranean has caused problems. And the Israelis and the Emiratis both have very negative views of Erdogan's expansionist ambitions in the region and are willing to contain that. So when the Emiratis today responded to Iranian criticisms of the deal by saying that this is really not about Iran, they may have actually been partially telling the truth, because I think that the Turkish factor played an important role in bringing these two countries together. However, it's also important to keep in mind that countries in the region, whether it be the Iranians and the Turks, the critics, as well as the supporters of the agreement, like Egypt and Bahrain, have known about informal Emirati cooperation with Israel for a long time. So it's not really being taken as that much of a surprise. So we have to separate the theater in their opposition or in their support from the actual geopolitical implications of it.
And James, would you agree with that? Do you think it's also, well, what do you think this deal will do for other outside powers in the region, such as China and Russia and Turkey, as Samuel just mentioned?
I think that there are two, Samuel no doubt is right. This also is addressed to Turkey. But let me address your earlier question to Sam more broadly. What it does is it deepens alliances and rivalries in the Middle East. It does not solve problems. And a lot of the problems in the Middle East and a lot of the conflicts have to do with domestic issues and with governance issues. And those issues are not going to be resolved by countries forming diplomatic relations. Um, China's obviously a factor, but I don't think it was a driver in terms of the establishment of diplomatic or the move towards diplomatic relations between the UAE and Israel. The China factor plays on a very different level, and that is that we're seeing a transition in Chinese policy towards the Middle East. If in the past Chinese policy was primarily focused on economic engagement with the Middle East and avoidance of any security or geopolitical engagement, we're now seeing that the Chinese realize that they have no choice but to get geopolitically engaged. And what they are trying to do is shape the environment in such a way that it will not suck them into intractable conflict. And the way they're doing that is by subtly pressuring, particularly Saudi Arabia, to dial down tensions with Iran to a point where you can have conflict management rather than conflict resolution, and in which some sort of multilateral security architecture in the Gulf becomes possible.
And James Dunn, what do you make of China and Iran's increasingly closer ties that we've seen in recent weeks? How do you think the China-Iran alliance would really change the geopolitical dimension in the region?
I don't think we're seeing closer ties between China and Iran as it's being described in the recent weeks. I think you've got to look very closely at what happened. What happened is that the Iranians drafted a document, officially accepted it, and presented it as a final draft of a massive economic and military cooperation agreement with China. China has not confirmed that. There's been two Chinese reactions to the formulation of this document. There's been the official foreign ministry reaction, which was basically to say, we have very good relations with Iran, we're discussing, and it was basically non-committal and very vague. And then there was a second response, which was in a second-tier Communist Party newspaper in Shanghai, in an op-ed by a relatively unknown Middle East scholar in China, who said, we're a long way away from an agreement. There's a lot of planning and negotiation that has to take place. And then the crucial thing he said, I think, was that the greater the decoupling between the United States and China, the more free China would be to act with Iran. Now, if you look at the facts of the engagement as proposed by the Iranians, $400 billion is widely in excess of anything that the Chinese have invested anywhere along the Belt and Road. The single largest Belt and Road investment that China has on a countrywide basis is Pakistan, and there we're talking about $62 billion. So what this is basically Iran and China sending messages. The Iranian messages to the Europeans and potentially to a Biden administration after the U.S. election of, you're driving us into the hands of the Chinese. To the Gulf, and particularly Saudi Arabia, saying, we're the top dog here. No matter what happens, when the chips are down, the Chinese are going to choose for us. And the message that the Chinese are sending is, you've got to get your act together, dial down the tension. We need to move towards a non-aggression agreement of some sort in the Gulf so that we can compensate for a reduced U.S. interest in the region and build a stable, more multilateral architecture.
Well, all the speculation about closer China-Iran ties does come at a time when China is in a very bitter conflict with the United States. And well, Samuel, do you think this is something that the U.S. should be worried about, China's growing influence in the region?
Well, I think that that's a great question. I think that certainly over the past month, we've seen a drastic shift in U.S. policy towards acknowledging the Chinese threat coming from the Middle East, if you will. How we noticed that particularly being driven by the U.S. State Department and personally by Mike Pompeo. So first of all, over with regards to Israel, the U.S. has been needling the Israelis on canceling any kind of ties towards Huawei and 5G. And they also used their frustration with Israeli ties with China as a way of almost putting a yellow light on the West Bank annexation back in June. And then there was a statement from the U.S. State Department about the Gulf countries, particularly, I think, referring to Saudi Arabia and the UAE in this case, warning them that closer ties with China would mean that they would have to choose. They have to choose between the United States or choose between China. So certainly there's a growing awareness of the Chinese influence in the Middle East that wasn't there before. Whether China actually poses a threat to U.S. interests, at this point, China is primarily involved as an economic actor. So it's involved in post-conflict reconstruction, in reality in Iraq, prospectively in Libya, Syria, and Yemen to varying degrees of stability. Its alignment with Iran certainly is a wake-up call to American interests, but it's important to keep in mind that even with the Chinese veto of the arms embargo and with this new security agreement, Iran is very averse to having foreign powers like China operate on their soil, and Chinese arms sales are a fraction of what they were in the early 2000s. So I think from a security standpoint, there really isn't much of a threat to the United States, but their economic influence could certainly make it, and the overall state of systemic tensions in the U.S. and China could make the China threat more real to U.S. policymakers in the months and years to come.
Right, and Samuel, you've mentioned the stronger economic ties that Iran and China have been forging over the years. But while the United States has been looking to downsize its military presence around the world, including in the Middle East, do you think then this would leave a gap for China to eventually step in? And how do Middle Eastern leaders actually view Beijing?
These are all great questions. I would say that I think that in China and in Russia as well, there's a general skepticism about any kind of pledges for the U.S. to withdraw militarily, because it always seems as if the forever war, the kind of permanent war doctrine seems to be prevailing in a large sense. And with regards to how the leaders in the Middle East view Beijing, I mean, I think that there's multiple prongs here. First of all, they don't really think that China is going to take a serious involvement in terms of being a security provider. And there's ambivalence about the way in which they're going to be involved in economic investments. Clearly, they want Chinese capital, but they're concerned about some of the consequences that come with it. Will they crowd out local companies, for example? What will the role of ZTE and Huawei be? And what will the implications of that be for U.S. investment crowding it out? Is the Belt and Road really about development, or is it about a form of neocolonialism? I mean, those concerns are very real. And if you look at the Arab barometer surveys, Arab public opinion about China, you notice that even in countries which have been touting their friendship with China in recent weeks, like Algeria, support and public opinion about Chinese investment is under 40%. In conflict zones, it's maybe around 50%, like Iraq and Libya. I mean, there's clear soft power problems that China needs to negotiate if it wants to become a major regional power.
Now, James, so 4 of China's 5 major partners in the region, that's Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt, and Iraq, they also happen to be U.S. allies. Do you think they'll come to a point where they have to pick one side? Do you think they'll then side with the U.S.? And do you think the U.S. can actually persuade the Gulf states to limit their engagement with Beijing?
The irony of all of this is that the Middle East may be one of the very few areas of in the world where Chinese and U.S. interests in many ways coincide. Now, I think the problem that the Gulf states and other Arab states have, but particularly the Gulf states, is that they're in a bind. Their traditional security guarantor was the United States and will remain the United States. The problem is that the United States is no longer a reliable guarantor. It did not respond to Iranian attacks on tankers in the UAE and Saudi oil facilities last year, for example, and that sent a message. And there were doubts going back to U.S. actions already under the Barack Obama administration. The irony also is that China and the Gulf states are in the same boat. With other words, like the Gulf, China relies on the United States to guarantee the flow of navigation, the secure flow of energy, without contributing to the security architecture. So for the Gulf states and for China, it's now a question of hedging bets. And the way they're looking at hedging bets, but they're looking at it differently, and this involves some degree of policy change on all parts, is that the U.S., ultimately the U.S. security or defense umbrella in the Gulf gets embedded in a multilateral structure that would involve China, Russia, and the Russians have put forward a very concrete proposal on this, as well as possibly India. And so what you would get is that the defense structure, the core of it remains American. It gets a greater degree of burden sharing. It allows a certain element of drawdown in terms of military forces, and the Gulf states and China have a greater sense of security because there is more than one state involved, and therefore they're not dependent on or vulnerable to the whims of the politics of that one state, being the United States.
Well, now this question goes to both of you before we go. So for the time being, let's start with you first, James. What is your outlook for regional stability? And do you think this UAE-Israel deal will lead to a wider recognition of Israel in the region, or do you think it will further escalate tensions?
I think that potentially you could see other states forging diplomatic relations or formalizing relations that they already have with Israel. Bahrain is a possibility, Oman, Morocco, Sudan. I don't think that it makes a fundamental difference. First of all, those relations existed already. Second of all, it does not address the very fundamental problems that the region has, both in terms of the disputes, whether it's the Israeli-Palestinian dispute, whether it's the Saudi-Iranian dispute, and the icing on the cake, obviously, in terms of diplomatic relations is Saudi Arabia. And it's hard to see that the Saudis would be able, given the role that they want to play as a leader of the Islamic world, a leader of the Arab world, it's hard to see that the Saudis would be able to forge formal diplomatic relations with Israel without some sort of resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that is acceptable not only to the Israelis, but also to the Palestinians.
And Samuel, your outlook on this, do you think this deal will lead to regional stability?
Well, I think that it could lead to several issues. As James noted, I mean, the Arab states, as well as Iran and Turkey, have been conditioned to the fact that informal Israeli cooperation with the Gulf countries is a geopolitical reality. I think that it could actually lead to new axes of instability. For example, it could lead to new coalitions against Iran and new coalitions against Turkey, which in turn polarize states. It could lead to new polarizations within the GCC. Already we've seen Kuwait, for example, with its pro-Palestinian stance, kind of stand out, whereas Oman has joined the Saudi-UAE consensus. So the Saudis have remained silent about this. So there's potential for inter-Gulf rivalries that could develop and could sharpen as a result of this. With regards to other states recognizing Israel, I think we could actually look towards some of the African states reviving some of their old partnerships. We should look at countries like Morocco, we should look at countries like Sudan, Mauritania, which signed a peace agreement with Israel in 1999, could return to that point of view. And in the terms of the Arab world, I would say Bahrain is the most likely state to normalize, followed by Oman. Saudi Arabia is unlikely to do so for the reasons that James mentioned, and also because King Salman himself is still an old-fashioned leader who's defensive of Palestinian rights. If Mohammed bin Salman becomes king, consolidates power, they could change, but I think the Saudis will deal with Israel informally and through Bahrain, preferentially, at least within the next 2 to 3 years.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave the discussion here, but, well, it was incredible hearing your insights. That was James M. Dorsey, Senior Fellow at Singapore's Nanyang Technological University, and Samuel Romani, a doctoral candidate in Politics and International Relations at the University of Oxford. Thank you both for joining the programme.
Pleasure to be with you.
Thank you.